It is October 19th, 2023. Welcome to Axiom News Live, where each Thursday we engage strengths to catalyze change. Here we start with what's strong rather than what's wrong and pay attention to real people doing real work to create the future we all know is possible in the here and now. This week we are joined by Angela Fell, co-founder of Northern Heart and Soul and the Neighbourhood Democracy Movement, and Shirish Kulkarni, an award-winning journalist, researcher, and community organizer. You know, as much as I am addicted to change, I also like a good classic. Way back in 1927, John Dewey was writing about the public and its problems. Chief among his concerns in that work were the fact that it was getting increasingly difficult in his time to locate the public and therefore locate and hear its voice. Nearly 100 years later, his work turns out to be prescient and still strangely relevant. Being neither locatable or a body from which we can hear means that the public becomes something diffused and so tends to be at the mercy of institutionalized forces. I feel it is time to shift the center of gravity and make community the ground from which all collaborative wisdom and work arises, our preeminent concern. Our two guests today, I believe, are doing just that. They are cultivating constancy of relationship in neighborhoods, hosting generative dialogue, and lifting up the voices of neighbors, community members, and citizens. And that is something that deserves our attention. With that, I'd like to invite Angela Fell and Shirish Kulkarni into our stream. Welcome, Angela and Shirish.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good
It's nice to see. I know that both of you know each other, and I don't yet know how. And I think I have been in spaces with each of you, but have we been in a space together, the three of us, before?
Maybe once or twice.
Maybe once or twice.
Yeah.
In the generative journalism workshops, is that the place where we
that
first
could be
met?
the place.
Yeah.
And I think that's how it all came together. I think I can remember Shirish meeting you through that, and credit to you, Angela, because I don't know that gathering would have occurred if it hadn't been for the weaving of relationships that you've been doing over a number of years. And it's funny the number of times I discover folks whose relational, what shall we say, connections very often wind up somewhere in your constellation. So I'm wondering, can we remember how it is that we came to know each other, Angela?
You and I, Peter, I think that was when you and Cormac Russell brought together what was Together Apart before Cultivating Community at the beginning of the pandemic, and invited community builders from around the world together. And I can remember we were learning and taking wisdom from what was happening in Italy at the time.
That's right. Yes. Yep. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's funny now, I was thinking about our relationship with and mutual relationship with Cormac. And the first time I met Cormac in person was maybe 7 years ago in Peterborough, Ontario. And we'd sort of exchanged some correspondence before then. And I remember that one of the first things he asked me after he shook my hand was, "So what are you working on that excites you the most?" And as it turns out, in our generative journalism work together, we've kind of landed that as the beginning question for a great many narrative works. And then again, I also credit starting with what's strong rather than what's wrong to Cormac. And so his influence is being felt all through our works together here.
I just realized actually, Peter, that I used that in a meeting yesterday without thinking of it as a generative journalism. It's just that's become part of my being now.
Right, right.
How do we start conversations which are much more open, much more generative, obviously? But yeah, it's funny how that's become, part of my life now, I suppose.
A bit of a life practice even.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Well, part of the aims of this show is to bring attention and light to things that are real in the world. I think the three of us both have practical works in the world and on the ground, and also some fairly comprehensive understandings and notions about why things are the way they are, the way they could be, and sort of the principles and philosophies at work. So maybe we'll dance between that space of the practical, the principle, the process, and what's actually real in the on the ground and in our world of work. So, with that, Angela, I think we suggested in the green room that we might just start with you and hear a little bit about what's most alive in your work on the world right now, and then we'll unfold our three-way conversation from there, because there are plenty of crossovers and jump points. So I'm looking forward to what we cook up together.
There really is like so much that is alive in the work at the minute. In fact, Jill and I had a coaching session with Jess Steele earlier on in the week, and we took the full hour just talking about what's alive in order to find out where we might want to go with what's alive.
Maybe what's most alive, even, yeah.
Well, so like from kind of about to sign the lease on a base, so that we're kind of got some roots in the community. That's really alive for us. Striking up a beautiful partnership with people focus group in Doncaster around real community based peer support. That's very alive. And then on top of that, I think the thing that's on my mind at the minute is this work that we're doing across Greater Manchester, across the region, with Greater Manchester System Changes and the Institute of Development Studies on an 18-month programme, being trained as systemic action researchers. And so we're all collecting stories around what are the current practices of solidarity and how do they demonstrate conditions which bring to life an equitable and liberated Greater Manchester. And obviously we've got to take that to the local language, you know, and the local place around.
Did you say equitable and liberated culture?
Greater Manchester, the region.
Greater Manchester. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So that's the kind of topic of initial inquiry that we're currently, I think there's 25 of us across Greater Manchester collecting, aiming to get 10 stories each, and some collective, and then begin to look at the themes. And it's interesting, like in the very, very early days of some of the things that are beginning to emerge. Yeah, so that's quite alive at the minute for me.
Can we go back to this word liberated? Liberated from what? And why that word? Or for what, I suppose?
Yeah, because it's interesting, isn't it? Having been on the Peter Block stuff and much of the discussions around confronting freedoms and liberation, like liberation is the word that Greater Manchester has chosen as system changes, to be liberated from the shackles of the system, you know, or to be liberated
that puts
from
it very succinctly.
from the oppression, you know, and kind of like when we look at the groups that make up like Greater Manchester System Changes, like kind of we have lots and lots and lots of different groups, you know, many people with no access to public resource to funding. You know, there's lots and lots of different groups of people for which liberation might have a very, very different definition around having enough. Yeah, having enough, having stuff that we can share, making our own decisions, looking after each other. The common stuff, really, isn't it? Being. together in the commons. That's kind of how we talk about it here when we're collecting the stories.
And you're collecting the stories. I would imagine that you've done some work on the questions that you're posing in order to bring the stories to the fore, and will the stories be something published, and if so, how?
Those are questions that I don't yet know the answers to. The questions that we're posing are kind of very open, and then digging deeper to explore like kind of the conditions that underlie that. And Jill and I are most definitely using a lot of our generative journalism questions to help us, and some of the workshops that we attended. And then we've got to do this process, like a causal process, which we've not got up to, around kind of tracking through the questions. So we're having these monthly meetings where we're kind of all learning from each other around the type of questions that worked well, and deepening our practice together as a community. And I've certainly not asked the people who I've collected stories from about whether they would want those stories to be published. But
Right,
I have
right.
at this stage got consent from them to share across Greater Manchester. But we've got this £400,000 pot of money to share across Greater Manchester as a collective. And one of the ideas that I want to take to it in November is around bringing the people who've shared stories together on a camp next May with their children and families. And they don't have to share the stories they've shared with us, but to share stories with each other and to connect that wider community of people who have contributed to that piece of research across the region. So wish me luck on that one.
When you say you've had some conversation with your colleagues around what questions work, what can you say about what are the markers of a question that worked, or what does it mean for a question
being
to
really
work?
open and
Okay.
curious. You know, maybe kind of giving somebody a little bit back of what they've said, and being just open and curious about, say more about that. The kind of really open and curious stuff that we have shared as a community of practice, I suppose.
I don't know what the two of you think about this, but I was having a conversation about a completely separate thing, but where this idea came up yesterday. And the thing that I found really interesting was when we're talking about essentially working with communities, doing participatory research, co-design, whatever. And actually, of course, the things which are most interesting in that space are the things which you don't expect. So actually a question that elicits the kind of response you are not expecting is the most interesting kind of question in that world. Because actually, if we get answers we expect, we're not learning anything. You're learning something from the answers you don't expect. I mean, there's something in there about why we expect the things we expect as well.
And there's a range of things you can expect, right? Like it could be one or two or three things, but if the bandwidth is narrow on it, then you won't be surprised. Yeah.
Yeah.
So surprise is a piece of what a question that works.
And memory as well. It's something that taps into a really powerful memory, or it might be a memory of a feeling or memory of an action or an activity. But that came up in the conversation we're having tomorrow. These are the things which mean something to us because they have that special impact on us. They connect to something at that kind of like almost that kind of physical level as much as an emotional level as well. So,
I can get a bit geeky on process, and we've talked about participatory action research, and it didn't take long for you in your description of what you're doing, Angela, to name stories and questions as fundamental components of that work, and which sounds very qualitative. And I've long, in my own experience with generative journalism, often found it, and because of our early connection with the appreciative inquiry world, which was very much about action research at the time, the questions themselves will often, or could often, catalyze a change for the person who is responding to the questions. And then the sort of sallying all of that forth into an immediately published story means that the thing that was just born during the engagement with a person around a question is suddenly in the public domain and in the public realm, attracting attention and moving matters forward. So there's something else about the questions being able to catalyze the birth of something new as an element of a question that works.
Yeah, I think as part of this process, we kind of did some, before we started this process with Greater Manchester System Changes, Jill and I decided to do some story collection last November time. So we did some kind of one-to-one stories, and we also did some kind of group story sharing sessions. And I've noticed that some of the people that we were collecting stories from, for them it was a very, very new experience, and they weren't used to being recorded, or they were kind of like, should I say this and should I say this, or, and the more we've practiced it, like, you know, I think that's kind of where I got a little bit stuck on the questions, because I always think it depends who you're alongside, kind of the way that you ask the questions, because you're guided very much by the person who's there. And when you said then about kind of publishing the stories immediately, like, I was looking at the script from the story session of 8 women that we collected last November, and I was thinking about how much had happened that was contained within that conversation.
Right. There's
And we're
something
just giving the
prophetic in
women
these
those
sometimes.
story back now,
Right.
as part of preparation for the next set of interviews. And so I'll be really interested to see kind of where that story, where the story goes next, when people have had the words back from last time to see, and then think about, like, where's my story now?
It's really interesting you talk about that, about the future and change and how those narratives, because it really reminded me, and also the difficulty for some people of telling their story, because I wonder if for you or for them that was something around how no one's ever asked them what they want to look like. And the reason I say that is because I was involved in a sort of, I suppose, a theatre project, but it was a very multimedia project called Galwad, which was a big, big arts project across the UK. And we presented a vision of the future, because it was a way of connecting people with the future, to say, what do we need to do now to create the future we want? Because the future feels often like a faraway place, right? And of course, it's not a faraway place, because the future starts this second, this minute, this hour.
It's seconds away.
Yeah, exactly. But then suddenly we're there 50 years hence. And we've not done the things we should have done or we were supposed to do. But we worked with, some of the most marginalised communities in Wales, where I'm from. And there were a lot of tears and a lot of surprise, because it was exactly that. People said, no one's ever asked me what I want the future to look like. And in a way, no one's ever asked me how I need the world to change. And it comes back to that thing about, we're talking about stories for systems change, narratives for systems change, because I'm coming from my background is from a traditional journalism background, which does not want to consider systems change, even though traditional journalism is telling stories. It does not want to consider systems change as part of its role or in any. And in fact, it's about maintaining the system consciously, but mostly unconsciously, honestly. And the example I use around that is when we talk about, the budget that the Chancellor's Exchequer puts out every year. The traditional journalism will say something along the lines of, as a result of this budget, you will be £200 a year better off, which sounds like objective, fact-based journalism. Until you think, what's the alternative? Oh, we could pay more taxes and then we would have better services. Oh, but journalism has framed taxes as inherently a bad thing. And of course, why is that? Because the kind of people that benefit from £200 in their back pocket rather than the public purse are people that use private healthcare, send their children to private schools, and guess what? They run the big media organizations. Those kinds of people run big media organizations. And when Angela talks about oppression earlier and systems of oppression, journalism likes to pretend, here's the systems of oppression over here, here's journalism over here, just reporting on those things in a kind of disinterested, detached way, when of course journalism is a fundamental part, mainstream journalism is a fundamental part of those systems of oppression by design.
And there's some intersection there with, you said earlier, Angela, that you'll ask people a question and there's often a reaction along the lines of, oh, what do you want me to say, or what should I say? And I wonder if part of that is because of what you've just described, Shirish, is that there is a repetitive narrative that gets played over and over and over and over again. And if a journalist is asking out of that context and out of that paradigm, they're asking the person we're interviewing or the source to play into that narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so suddenly the person whose story you're asking into is confronted with, am I supposed to answer according to the narrative I think they want, which is suddenly a dissociative act, and I think we've argued before, even a violent act, rather than being liberated through a narrative process to find a story that emanates from within that can then be carried into the world in such a way as to create the world.
Yeah.
So that takes the thinking about the force of precedent and momentum in a current system and places it as against a person who's never been asked to share their story before.
I mean, and it also connects back to that thing about the unexpected being the exciting thing, because truth is, I've done this for 25 years. Most journalists will go to an interview for a piece, knowing what the piece is going to say.
Yes.
They've already decided. So in a way, the interview is to get people to say the thing they've already decided they want them to say to fit into the narrative. It's like we have a pro person, we have a con person, so we need the pro person to say this, we need the con person to say this. It does not leave any space for the unexpected. And so you're imposing the narrative on the person before, and because whatever they say, you get to choose what goes in the piece, whether it's a written piece or a TV piece, then whatever they say, almost, because you've already defined that narrative as part of the system, then nothing is ever going to change unless we do something different, which, can be generative journalism, can be other kind of, can be normal journalism, but just with a bit more imagination.
I think I heard here less of I haven't been asked before and more of I didn't think what I had to say mattered.
Right.
And I
Another
heard
piece.
more of I have been asked, but I'm never listened to. And I've got to tell you the things I think you want to hear in order to get the service off you or to get you away from my doorstep or my life. Or I'm being a case study in your domineering narrative in order to celebrate how well you have fixed me. And I think because that has been people's experience with, like today, actually, somebody who I would have liked to have collected a story from last year, but I didn't feel like I had a deep enough relationship with her. Today I felt a baby shower. I'm going to ask her. I'm going to pluck up the courage and ask her, will she share a story with me? But instantly, I knew that she thought I was asking her to share her trauma with me. I instantly and had to kind of really clarify what I was looking for if in a story. So I think there's all that kind of playing about, isn't there, in the collecting of narratives, and as you were talking about, like kind of the systems of oppression, I think kind of something that is really beginning to show itself quite clearly in the very few stories that have been collected from across Greater Manchester, to my eyes anyway. I don't know about to the whole group's eyes, is the story that is held up by the dominant system in the same way that the media does that. So that's played out at every level. And so I do feel really hopeful that this Greater Manchester work might be able to put a little bit of power to the elbow of really shining a light on that.
I don't know what you two think, but it feels to me like what we're talking about, and I've never really, it's so lovely having these conversations, I've never really thought about it in this way before, but what we're talking about is the recurrence of predetermined narratives shaping the future. And so the really important work is to present narratives which are not predetermined, which are surprising, which are different from those predetermined. That's the thing which is going to create change. But they're so powerful, those predetermined narratives. And yeah, it comes back to the unexpected and all those things.
Yeah, I also think there's room for the very ordinary as well.
Sure.
Not just the surprising, the very ordinary stories.
But I wonder if actually the systems of oppression don't understand that ordinariness. In a way, that's part of the problem. Their ordinariness is very different from other people's ordinariness. And again, it's something, I suppose, that's something around the very narrow demographic of people who are professional journalists, let's say, that I remember actually, well, there's I call it in the UK, in England, I call it the Ealing problem, Ealing being a suburb of London, and a disproportionate number of people who make television news living in Ealing. In Cardiff, it's the Pontcanner problem. And actually, someone's done the research in Sweden. So there's an academic paper around this. So it's something like, don't quote me on the exact figures, but it's something like 80% of the journalists in Sweden live in Stockholm, and 80% of those live in Södermalm, which is one suburb of Stockholm. And so actually all those narratives actually being the people of Ealing making news by the people of Ealing for the people of Ealing about the people of Ealing, except it's the national news. And so they can't look beyond their own experience because that's all they actually see. And any other narrative, any other narrative is incomprehensible to them. Because in fact, I had this exactly when I moved back from London to Wales. It was during a period of recovery, which seems like an eon ago, but was actually only 10 years ago after the financial crisis. And yeah, house prices were going up in London. So that's all they were talking about. And I'd be coming down to look at places to live here in Wales, and houses would have been on the market for 3 or 4 years, because everything was behind. And I would say this in news meetings, and people just could not comprehend. And it certainly wouldn't appear then on the news. So it's that unwillingness or inability to look beyond your own experience as well. And so I think that's what stories give us. That's the point of telling stories, to look beyond our own experience, to share our experiences.
Yeah. Ordinary stories don't win awards, but they do connect hearts.
No. God, don't get me started on awards, Angela. Because again, awards drive a particular kind of journalism, but which is not a useful kind of journalism because it's people. And in fact, honestly, in those news meetings, the first thought was never what do people need from our journalism? The first thought was always, what is the BBC doing about this story? How can we do our journalism better than other journalists? In a way, thinking what another journalist would think of the story rather than thinking, actually, is this providing useful information?
Yeah. And that narrative dominates across the board, doesn't it? So I could say that I often feel that local governments are more interested in the performance of each other than they are in wondering how the citizens where they live think about how they perform.
Yeah. Although, actually, I think that's true, but there's a way you can use that in a kind of powerful way as citizens. There's a famous kind of solutions journalism story which is held up as kind of iconic, and I'm going to say it's in Cleveland, but again, don't quote me on that. But actually, there was some real issues with, I think, like lead in the pipes in the kind of public housing. And so what they did to kind of, the council, the district council, would say, oh, there's nothing we can do about this problem everywhere. It's just too expensive to solve. And so the journalists went to an area in a different state with similar problems, similar kind of economic conditions, where they'd fixed all the lead piping. And they did a story which compared the data between those two, and that put so much pressure on the Cleveland Council that they ended up fixing stuff, because they could have done that with them. They just didn't care enough. But they cared about the thing Angela describes, which is how they look compared to the district council in wherever, Detroit or whatever. So it shouldn't be that way. But if we know that's the way, we can use that, I suppose.
It's no wonder that some local people think that their views don't matter, is it?
Well, yeah. Oh, you're muted, Peter.
There's something about the pressure that stories shared in public will bring to a system, right? So if the stories are, as you said, institutional, Shirish, so that the people that are telling the stories are in the institution, they just repeat the institutional narrative and repeat the past. They project the past into the future, and there's nothing surprising in that. And to some degree, that's ordinary and in the boring sense. Whereas the stories that you're cultivating, Angela, are stories that are ordinary in that they are about ordinary people, but they're often about surprising things ordinary people do. And the more stories along those lines that are published, the there's it becomes a counterpoint to the more dull, repetitive institutional narratives that starts to I've got muscles in mind, but they muscle in on the narrative territory of the institutional narrative and can push the institutional narrative in a different direction. So getting these stories from the ground up and out where they're visible does become a force for change in community.
Yeah. I would say that much of what's growing around here has grown out of doing things like the community awards, which is just sharing stories of good things that people are doing around here with other people who are also doing good things around here, and just watching what emerges from that, which was something that I'd seen was really effective in Furs Bromford with Paul Wright and the community builders there, like creating a space in a room where a few hundred people hear somebody else's story and then begin to connect and grow more things, and I think that led us to want to create AUP, Wigan West Community News, like to begin to share those stories wider across the community. And we're just about to, it's at print at the minute actually, the second edition of that. And so much has grown from the first edition. So that in itself is like beginning to have life of its own in the community. So the importance of storytelling and story sharing and people seeing, actually, if they can do that, then I can do that. I know Luke over there, somebody had an idea and now they're doing it. Why don't we?
Absolutely. All right, so why don't we just take a quick break to give our listeners a bit of breathing room and for ourselves too. But before we go, Angela, can you would you be willing to repeat the statement about an equitable and liberated as your sort of calling question, and maybe just say a word or two about what you hope will come as a result of that particular project? And then, Shirish, when we come back, you had a challenge statement that I think would be a nice follow-on to hearing again Angela's declaration of possibility here in this one. Can you recall how that went, Angela?
Yeah, so the kind of top line is, what are the current practices of solidarity and how do they demonstrate conditions which bring to life an equitable and liberated Greater Manchester? And
Beautiful.
for me, where I live, that means that we would have a lot of local people doing great stuff together and owning local assets and running local businesses and deciding how to spend the cash and use the cash together in the commons.
Beautiful.
And
I
Bert
love
agrees.
it. Excellent. So Bert does. All right. Thanks for that, Angela. Yvonne, if you're willing to run the invitation to Cultivating Community, our bi-weekly Feast for the Soul that Angela mentioned early, and we might even have seen you there once or twice, Shirish, but we'll run that short invitation, and then we'll come back and we'll spend a little bit of time with what's left on some of the remarkable things you're up to, Shirish.
If you would like to experience genuine connection with others, being heard, patience, levity and laughter, warmth, light, smiles, new, deepening, and healing relationships, then cultivate community with us. Coined by participants as a fortnightly feast for the soul, these 90-minute gatherings hosted by Axiom News offer a weaving of small group dialogue led by carefully crafted questions, followed by light, whole group reflection. Each dialogue round deepens connection and enlivens possibility between and amongst those who participate. All are welcome. Learn more and RSVP for our next gathering by visiting the Events tab in A New Commons, our sister initiative in Mighty Networks, at anewcommons.mn.co/events.
Hey, welcome back. So, Shirish, you had in the green room shared something about a project you're in right now, and the challenge statement sounded pretty challenging. Would you be willing to recount that for us and see where it takes us?
Yeah, so Yvonne's got the link to the kind of project I'm working on, which is a project which is built out of some research and development I've been doing on what you might loosely call journalistic storytelling for the last 4 years or so. But that project has now moved to a collaboration with the BBC, which has its pros and cons. I think the biggest pro is that if you can make change in an organization like the BBC, then you can make change. You can make really big change. So the challenge, so we've called it the News for All project. I actually don't massively like the word news because I think news, what we commonly understand as news, often doesn't have very much value because it's moments in time rather than a kind of longer holistic kind of view of the world. But it's because it matches the BBC's strategy, which is called Value for All. It's about providing value for all. And very clearly, none of journalism is really providing value for all. 50% of people largely are not engaging with mainstream journalism. And I don't care about that for the sake of individual organizations, but I care about that for the sake of healthy societies. And so the challenge statement as expressed, and I think this will be living because I will constantly be learning stuff, is how might we tell different stories in different ways to meet the information needs of people who don't currently see or get a value from journalism in order to enhance their capacity to take action on behalf of themselves and their communities, because healthy societies rely on informed and active publics. Now, the thing...
I've just noticed that both that statement, Shirish, and the one Angela shared, the best stuff was at the end.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Well,
that's kind of funny because I spent a lot of time in a newsroom, and the number of times I'd read a story and go, "You got to flip it upside down. Your lead is your last paragraph."
Yeah,
well,
that's a different conversation, which we'll have about the inverted pyramid.
Okay,
I've done a lot of work on.
I'm sure.
But the thing in that, so I mean, the interesting bit is different stories in different ways, right? Because it's different stories, and in a way, this conversation has helped crystallize some of that thinking for me, because it's the different stories, the stories we don't hear, the stories which aren't told, and which are told in different ways, which are surprising, even if they're ordinary. So that's important. But the thing which is challenging to most journalists is the bit about enhancing people's capacities to take action on behalf of themselves and their communities, and saying that that is because healthy societies rely not just on informed publics, but active publics. And it's really weird because journalists say to me, have been challenged by that and have said, oh, but that's not what we do. We don't kind of inspire action or give pathways to action. And it's quite easy to counter, actually, because you just say, so you're saying you just want people to do absolutely nothing with the information you give them. I mean, it's a view. It's not a view that kind of stands up to much scrutiny. But that's sort of the way journalists are, and I include myself in that, are trained and are brought up through the system. But the thing I say to kind of to take them on to hopefully the next step is, look, the 50% of people who aren't engaging with journalism, I don't believe in particularly in the framing of news avoidance, which is very popular. I think of it as people are frustrated sense seekers. They want journalism to do sense making for them. Now, journalism, mainstream journalism, does a thing, but it's a thing driven by the business model of journalism, which doesn't incentivize sense making. It inspires something incentivizes something entirely different, which is why you get kind of clickbait stories and so on. Sense making is not incentivized by the business model of journalism. Now, you could argue with the BBC, as I do, that actually the BBC is not in competition with other news providers because it's license fee funded, and actually it is designed, the whole point of the BBC is to solve market failures. So actually it should be leaning into solving the problems of those 50% of people. But a large proportion of those 50% will be people who are marginalized or excluded, as Angela described, in some way. Now, they need systems change to not be marginalized and to have better life and better access to equity. And systems change does not happen without no action. It can only happen with action. And so, yeah, until we kind of just put that logic together, we're never going to meet the needs of those people who aren't engaging because they are marginalized. But very few people are putting that logic together in kind of mainstream journalistic thinking.
What can you say about how the project you're working on, or how it has already, addressed the question of the intention to cultivate or encourage or inspire agency on the part of community members?
We haven't addressed it yet. But we are. Okay. Funnily enough, I did a session across with all BBC News staff a few weeks ago, which was about news avoidance. But I said straight out, I don't really believe in this framing.
Can you just say what news avoidance is, Shirish, for people that aren't familiar with that phrase, really, myself included?
Yeah, so it's a kind of a framing that people who aren't consuming news are avoiding it because, I don't know, people think, oh, they find it too complicated or too traumatic or whatever, or all of those things are true. That news is too complicated, too traumatic, well, not trauma informed, all those things. But I don't think people want to willfully avoid understanding the world and their place in it. If you ask people, do you want to understand the world and your place in it? Everyone, I think almost everyone, is going to say yes. There's no reason to say no to that question. So then it's a product problem. The way I describe it is essentially you're going into the supermarket looking for sense making. You see the journalism on the shelf and you think, oh, it doesn't do that. So in the same way as you wouldn't buy a washing powder that didn't wash your clothes, you're not consuming journalism, which doesn't do sense making. And the starting point for all this is, guess what? People make rational decisions. And again, that's something that journalism doesn't. And I suppose policymakers as well, Angela would probably have something to say on this, that actually policymakers, journalists, don't trust people to make rational decisions. They think they're doing things for kind of weird reasons, what that is it's reasons they don't understand, which comes back to that looking beyond your own experience. Guess what? People have different experiences, but they make rational decisions within those experiences. Just because you as a policymaker or a journalist don't understand that experience doesn't mean it's an irrational decision. It would be maybe an irrational decision for you, but your experience is different.
It strikes me that part of the problem is that the news doesn't actually feel particularly relevant. And a part of it, and it's not going to make sense to me if it's not relevant to me. So I avoid the news, Shirish, and it's crazy. I drop in every 10 years, and it's the same damn story as when I left 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Like almost, you can, well, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
The recent events in Gaza, we've heard most of those stories before. The same propaganda, the same story, the same outline, and it's not getting us anywhere.
No.
And so, it's and if the narratives are institutional, and this is something else I wonder about with regards to inspiring or encouraging community members to exercise their agency, and the role of the journalist in providing them information so they can do that.
Yeah.
I wonder about even letting go of that role. That it's not our job to inform people, but it's our job to discover what people are up to and share those stories, because those stories are the ones that are likely to be relevant to the person who goes to the same grocery store as me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's so much stuff I could say about all of that and the reasons you're avoiding the news and stuff like that. But actually, the thing which I think is most important here, the thing which is most live, is actually, we've talked about generative journalism, but we need to talk about generative AI, because, and this is the bit of the conversation about generative AI in journalism, which is not talked about. If you go to a conference now about journalism, every session is about generative AI, and they're all packed because people want to know how can I do this more cheaply? How can I do more cheaply? But actually, the bit of the conversation that isn't happening is, guess what? Right now, most of what is traditionally understood as journalism or news journalism can be delivered by generative AI in search. So you'll go to Google, you'll go to Bard and Microsoft, you'll type in what's happening in Gaza, and you'll get your answer, not from a news organization, but from generative AI, which has its, risks and rewards. But if we want to be journalists in the future, we will have to do the things which the term is, cannot be disintermediated. But the easy way of saying this is the things that only a human being can do and can't be done by a machine. And those are all the things we care about: connection, care, collaboration. That's what the job of a journalist will be in 2 years.
Connection, care, and collaboration. Things a machine can't do. Yes.
Exactly. Yes. And that's the bit that's not being talked about, but that's the bit which is really exciting. Arguably, the role of a journalist should always have been those things.
Healing art, even. I think there is a healing capacity in generative and narrative inquiry.
Yeah. But certainly in the future, if you want to be a journalist, just being able to write content is not going to be a skill.
You'll be out of work. Yeah. So, to save your bacon, jump on over to the connecting, caring, and collaborative human space where narrative actually matters.
Yeah, 100%. But like,
or find another job that you really love.
Right.
Yeah. But I think that stuff's really interesting to me. And then, as you talk about, as you say, the thing that was that, letting go of the role of informing would be a really interesting way, because actually, what do journalists know more than other people? I've never been a big believer in I have some special skill. I'm just a kind of storyteller, but everyone can tell stories. There's nothing special about me. There's something special about stories. There's nothing special about me as a storyteller.
The thing that makes us special, I think, is that I'm here now paying attention to you and offering to apply my craft to the sharing and uplifting of your story.
Yeah. 100%. And I have trained as a psychotherapist as well. didn't finish my training for various reasons.
How do you hold all these things in the same body, Shirish?
And I will
surprise.
A BBC journalist and a psychotherapist. I don't know. Maybe you need to be liberated.
Going back to that stuff around those predefined narratives, I got sent to do an interview with someone about a topic. It was about welfare benefits, actually. And again, I haven't thought about this in this context before. And because I took my psychotherapy or counselling world with me, in the same way as I apparently take my generative journalism life with me, I did this interview, and actually he wasn't a very good case study, because that's what it was. I don't use that word in my normal
You're not going to mince those words, right? Yeah.
That's the point of that. He wasn't a very good case study for the story, but I was asking him some open generative questions, because that's what I did anyway, before knowing that's what it was. And he stopped for a minute. And so I stayed quiet and used silence. And the cameraman was actually poking me in the back of the shoulder because he was getting uncomfortable. And I just waited. And he told me that his wife, who was 40, had died, 3 months before, just died in her sleep, had 3 kids, under 6. He didn't want to give his kids to a childminder because he wanted to kind of look up there. And there's this incredible story which came out of that. And he couldn't work because he was a taxi driver, and then he wanted to look up. But this incredible, because from not doing the thing, just getting the sound bite, which the producer somewhere else had wanted, because that wasn't the story. It was a predefined narrative, but that wasn't the story this guy had to tell. And we don't leave space for that. I mean, something else we were talking about was, that journalism wants certainty. It wants to give you, and this comes back to your thing about letting go of informing, actually. It wants to define the world in certain and simple terms. But the world is not certain and simple. It is complex and uncertain. And that's the only way to understand the world. And the structures of journalism don't allow us the space to consider the world in those terms.
Beautiful. Okay. That's not a bad place to walk us into our closing circle. I'll invite some reflection on what meaning was made for us during our time together, or perhaps what we're taking away.
I think I'm looking forward to the day when the resource available to journalism shifts to care, community and collaboration. So I'm leaving with great hope around that. And I'm also leaving thinking about stories of solidarity and how some of the key ingredients that have revealed themselves more strongly to me as we've been talking are around kind of joy and mutual support and food and dancing and being in relationship. And those are the practices that are really beginning to reveal themselves across the system.
Beautiful. Thank you, Angela.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's 2 things. It's those understanding the power of those predetermined narratives and working very hard to provide surprising, the ordinary, the narrative which helps us to change our minds, I suppose. And also that thing of letting go of informing, actually, Peter, you put it really well, because it's like what gives journalists the power to do that. Actually, it's a collective power to make sense of the world. We can only do that collectively. We can't do that as individuals.
What's arriving for me is, again, this notion that I sense a journalist, a generative one anyway, has done their job well when a question posed is met with quiet. It's different than an investigative journalist asking you a question you have the answer to and don't want to provide an answer. But if a question posed invites someone into silence while they search around for a response to the question they're not used to hearing, then something new is about to be born. And I think that was in some of the stories that each of you told today too, to suggest that that's the mark of a good question and something life-giving about to happen. All right. So with that, thank you, Shirish and Angela. It's always a pleasure to be with you both together and one-on-one, and it's great to be tracking with what you're up to. So hopefully we can have you back before too long, and we probably could carry on the conversation for quite some time because we've opened some things up that I would love to chase down. So maybe we can find a way to do that either in this forum or in a community forum. So thank you both very, very much for taking time out and coming out to play. So with that, we will call our time together closed for today. We will, of course, be running again and invite you to join us next Thursday at 2 o'clock ET, 7 p.m. in the UK. I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, you can subscribe below and find us at axiomnews.com on LinkedIn, Facebook, and X. I'm your host, Peter Pula. Thanks for listening.